Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co host, Nathan Rittenhouse. In this episode, we talk about the recent debate between Alex O'Connor and David Wood on whether or not Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. But we don't really get into the weeds on the actual arguments in the conversation itself, more on the idea of disenchantment and what it means to be skeptical about almost everything. We then get into a little bit of a critique of the Snow White film and how that plays into this idea of cultural disenchantment, and then look at how Christians should be thoughtful in thinking about making commitments that help us not get lost in a massive sea of choices. So this is a very practical conversation that helps us make sense of the moment in which we find ourselves. Thinking Out Loud is a listener-supported podcast. If you appreciate the work that we do, not just through the podcast, but through our traveling and speaking and preaching and teaching, university campus work, curriculum development, and the rest of it, we really do appreciate your support. You can send us feedback at info@koltogether.com. You can like and share our content, or you can donate on our donate page at koltogether.com.
Nathan, it finally happened. Alex O'Connor and Dr. David Wood actually debated. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there was some controversy or some controversy. If we're going to use the British, just kidding. But there was
Oh, you're
quite a
bilingual.
bit of, you're right. There was quite a bit of kerfuffle surrounding the original debate. I don't know if this was news to me, but
Was
there
it the
were,
topic of did Jesus claim to be divine, or is it like broader?
it was.
Okay.
It always was, but there were some death threats circulating, none of them against Alex O'Connor specifically, but there was security concerns. So this debate was supposed to happen a while ago. I'm not sure what the precise date was, and Alex O'Connor pulled out at the last minute. But then it was rescheduled, set up again, and this time not only did he not pull out, but he actually managed to go on his I think the debate took place on his birthday. So there's some
Yeah.
commitment for you.
Well, hang on, back up.
But
Why would there be a security concern between an atheist and a Christian debating did Jesus claim to be God?
that was so David Wood is reliable in a number of different categories. He's reliable as a
I
good
now know
debater.
where this is going.
He's also reliable as a wit and has what our late friend Emil Qureshi used to call, and his dear friend Emil Qureshi used to call, I think, what would they call it? A sanctified sense of sarcasm. So those were his very observations when Alex O'Connor initially pulled out, and those are observations he brings into his opening statements, actually. Hey, great, Alex, for you to finally show up. But yeah, essentially he had said a while ago on his YouTube channel that if even though, I mean, there were threats circulating, they weren't directed specifically at Alex O'Connor, and Alex O'Connor would look like the knight in shining armor to Muslims if he's able to mount successful debate or, to show in the debate that Jesus didn't claim to be the Son of God or
So the threats
didn't
were
claim to
against
be
David from his
didn't claim to
usual
be God.
givers.
Against David, I guess. I don't know all the details. I mean, certainly, I mean, David is David has basically he's not understated. We'll put
Well,
it that
okay, I'll
way.
give you an example. If people don't know, David Wood recently showed up in Speaker's Corner in London wearing a shirt that had the Quran printed on it so that no Muslim could kill him without destroying the Quran. And he called it his jihadi armor. Um,
Yes.
it's that
Mhm.
that's David Wood to
That's David Wood.
in one meme right there.
Yep, and that's a fitting way to introduce him. But the two of them, in case you didn't know, the two of them, for listeners, were debating the question: did Jesus claim to be God? And I want to talk a little bit about that debate, and I also want to talk a little bit about what seemed to be Alex O'Connor's strategy, and because I think it gives us a window into kind of a tendency that we see often in our cultural moment, and we're going to highlight some of those issues. It has to be said, Alex O'Connor he's fantastic. So I'm an Alex O'Connor fan. Some of you may be familiar with him. Check out his channel, by the way. He's often in conversation with Christians and people who are adjacent to Christianity. So he's had discussions with Justin Brierley, who'd be familiar to some of you from Premier Christian. What's his Premier?
Premier One? No, it's a
Yes,
fencing company. Is it Premiere?
Well, we Justin Brierley, you can look him up, but he's done a lot of really good work in the apologetics world. He's hosted a lot of really good conversations between Christians and skeptics. He's also so Alex O'Connor's also spoken with Tom Holland, people like this. He's very respectful. He's extremely well spoken. He's very smart. So he's a worthy opponent. He's also only 26 years old. So quite impressive. So I think he carries himself very well in this debate. And then there and you know,
Premiere,
and then he's
unbelievable.
there premier unbelievable. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. It was right on the tip of
Good
my
job,
my
Google.
tongue. I thought, why am I struggling here? Age. I'll just blame it on my age. But yeah, Justin Brierley is premier unbelievable. But so Alex O'Connor, he's worth checking out. And so he is I think I'm not quite sure. I think he would define himself as agnostic
Yeah,
at
I
this
think he is
point.
like the flag carrier of the new wave of atheism, but under the agnostic. Like he's respectful,
Yes.
he's pushy when he needs to be. He's very not Christian, but also not. He doesn't quite have the same maybe
Vehement.
thin-eyed look down the nose at the like all Christians are stupid kind of thing that maybe you got in some other previous iterations.
Definitely.
So yeah, he's
That
listenable.
that's fair. That's very fair. So in the debate, obviously David Wood is maintaining that Jesus did claim to be God. I can bring in a few specifics of the debate, but really, and we can talk about that as we go. But part of what I want to look at is what Alex O'Connor is doing, which I think is very interesting. So essentially, when you're arguing from a position of skepticism, you have your work cut out for you. And what I mean by that,
No, that's true philosophically, but not true culturally.
no, I'm
Let's
getting
parse
there.
that out. Yeah.
No, I'm getting there. But no, but you really do. Let's just from a technical standpoint, you've got your work cut out for you. Now, on the one hand, you have a cultural moment where that is in sympathy with you. So the cultural default here, let's just describe the cultural default for a section, for a second here. The cultural default assumption is that skepticism is synonymous with higher levels of intelligence.
Mhm.
Now, this is not necessarily true at all, by the way. It's this is actually
We're skeptical
a
of the claim.
it's a deep yes, it's a deep-seated cultural bias is what it is. But the assumption is if you ask a lot of questions, if you're skeptical of particularly popular or major positions that have been held down the ages, then you're a free thinker, you're an independent thinker, you're a tough-minded thinker.
No, wait,
Now
listen to those terms. Listen to the terms you just used. Free thinker, independent thinker, those are all couched in the cultural assumption that
yes.
anyway, just the terminology is loaded from the get-go.
And and from a pop culture standpoint, 2 figures who represent this really well are from The X-Files, that great show of the '90s, but you had Agents Fox Mulder and Dana Scully. Fox Mulder is the believer, open-minded, often chasing conspiracy theories, believes in elaborate conspiracy theories, and then there's Dana Scully, who is a medical doctor, the classic skeptic, tough-minded, asks hard questions, and the two often play off of each other. But they're kind of embodiments of this sort of cultural assumption. Almost they function almost like television archetypes.
Ooh, question. Is Father Brown a G.K. Chesterton character here who's a priest and the
Yeah,
was that normal, or was Chesterton writing him as a early pushback against these categorical distinctions? Because often
great question.
if you read Father Brown is a Christian believer, but is far less gullible than anybody else in the rest of the he really embodies this wise as serpent, innocent as doves kind of thing. Do you know the history on
Yes,
that? Was Chesterton writing him as a cultural response to this, or was that just seen as like, "Oh, yeah,
yes.
that was normal?"
No, in fact, he was, and I'm surprised, given how incisive what you just said. Given the incisiveness of your remarks, I'm surprised you didn't know this. It sounds like you did. He's modeled as a antithesis to Sherlock Holmes.
Hmm.
So yes, and actually, he has a television descendant, and his name is Columbo. But
Ah, right.
what f yes, and Columbo, like Father Brown, he's not a Catholic priest like Father Brown, but he comes across as this kind of bumbling fool to everybody, and he's aware of it, and he uses that to his advantage. Everybody underestimates him, and in fact, he's a superb detective. With Father Brown, everybody assumes he's just a naive Catholic priest with his head in the clouds. But what they fail to take into account is that he hears confession on a routine basis. He has a good anthropology, knows the human heart, and yeah, so he's not a wizened cynic, but he's also not a naive dupe. He's got a great head on his shoulders, and so he's
Maybe
able
we'll
to
come
solve
back
these
there
cases.
as a model for where we want to go as Christians by the end of this conversation.
Yes, I like to call that actually the Father Brown principle because he's a wonderful character, and it's a great picture of the way the world underestimates people who are righteous, and it's actually people who are righteous who have their heads on straight, who are
Look at
realists.
that.
We
A
don't
little
we
shout
don't
out
tend
to reading fiction.
That's right, and we don't tend to associate virtue with realism. We tend to think of it as very possibly uplifting or edifying. "Oh, this guy's really good." If you know somebody who's a really good person, do you think of them also as knowledgeable? That's just one of those subtle ways that we kind of make a division there. We think, well, goodness is not necessarily doesn't go hand in hand with intelligence or
Or being
or realism, seeing things as they actually are. In fact, we tend to think the opposite sometimes. Oh,
all right,
such a good person that they yeah. But anyway,
I got you off topic.
so
I opened the door and you
so you
jumped out. All right, back to
how
Alex O'Connor.
dare you? Back to Alex O'Connor. So, but that said, okay, so there's cultural bias there that favors the skeptic as the smarter person. But on the other hand, just technically speaking, if you're a skeptical person, you have your work cut out for you because you have everything that seems to be very obvious or that seems to be very relatively straightforward. Now you have to somehow explain it all away. And so the notion that Jesus claimed to be God is quite straightforward. It's just not that complex, and it's fairly obvious.
And David
And
would have
anybody
spent his life having this conversation, so that's a tough.
well, and not just David Wood. You're
All right,
arguing
two
against
thousand years of
2,000 years of robust, highly intellectual, highly sophisticated, highly subtle conversation between some of the greatest minds who have ever graced, the printed page or
and
or
and
otherwise.
let's say that there are a lot of people who believe that Jesus claimed to be God who do not believe that Jesus is God.
Sure.
That's not what's being asked here. Did Jesus
Absolutely.
himself think that? So we're not saying, oh, it's only Christians who think that Jesus claimed to be God. No, plenty of people who aren't Christians think Jesus claimed to be God. That doesn't mean they believe
Some
it.
of the
It's
most
just
Yeah, some of the most skeptical voices out there would readily concede, "Oh, he claimed to be God. That was perhaps the key ingredient in his execution." So, but if you deny that, so you're going against 2,000 years of tradition, and just I have to pause here again because some people, "Oh, who cares about empty tradition?" Okay, let me just pause there for a second. First of all, that's a really silly thing to say. I'm just gonna say it. That's silly. To think that going against 2,000 years, of tradition makes you somehow more noble or more open-minded, that's just a symptom of our age,
well,
and here's the
okay,
other
hang on.
here
Well, finish that thought, but there's a very important distinction we need to make.
and there's another irony here though too. That itself is part of another tradition. There's a new tradition that says you should be against all traditions, and it's called the Enlightenment. And the classic phrase from that is Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, saying, "Dare to know." So dare to step outside of prevailing traditions, dare to fly in the face of dogma, dare to call it all into question. But that whole tendency, it's a modern tendency. So it's a newer, but it is itself a tradition. It's its own tradition. It's a thoroughly modern tradition. And so you're standing on the shoulders of just another set of giants. So in other words, you're still part of a tradition in doing that. Continue to Nathan.
Yeah, well, we don't. I don't want you to hear us saying that just because something has been believed for 2,000 years that it's true.
No,
Because there's
that's not
plenty.
actually that's not what I'm saying at
That's
all.
that
I'm saying
it's
to
not.
just flip
I
it.
just want you to
Yeah.
clarify that for the people who are listening, because the Egyptians believe things for thousands of years that we don't think are true. The Chinese dynasties believe things. Fill in the
Yeah.
blank. So just clarify that before we move on here.
Okay, if it even needs to be clarified, I'm saying we don't want to be that dismissive. I'm not saying
Oh,
that,
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
just because something's been believed for that long, but I'm saying if something's been believed for that long, you have a long-standing tradition of careful argumentation, often highly refined with great subtlety, it's worthy of your respect. And I think this of other religious traditions, by the way. I think the Bhagavad Gita is worthy of our respect and esteem. I think there are great profundities there. Do I think it's, you know, gospel truth? No. I think there's great profundity in Buddhist thought. Does that mean I think it's all true? Well, no. But so that's all I'm saying. It's the
Yep.
dismissiveness that I'm targeting when I say that.
Yep.
And I'm not saying that Alex O'Connor is doing that here necessarily, but there are plenty of people who do. But all that to say, your work's cut out for you. You've got to fly in the face of all of that and say, well, somehow, in some way, all of these people got it drastically wrong. So there's actually quite a large burden of proof on your shoulders. Now, I think that's worth stressing because so often in these debates, particularly with skeptics, they will always say, no, no, the entire burden of proof is on you. And here, it's just so often it's not the case. If you're flying in the face of 2,000 years of tradition that has maintained Jesus claimed to be God, the burden of proof is really on you. So Alex O'Connor finds himself in the position of having to say, of every instance where Jesus appears to be claiming divinity, think about the passage in one of the most explicit, there are many, but one of the really explicit, I'd love to hear you weigh in here, Nathan, is the one that comes in Mark's gospel, where he says, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. That's an allusion to a passage back in the book of Daniel. It's very explicit and it causes absolute fury for the people who hear it. So you have to
Well,
somehow say,
that
well,
passage in particular was Nabil's. I think it was the linchpin in Nabil's coming out
it
of
was.
what
It was.
or,
That was part of what made me
or
take it so seriously.
Mhm.
But for if you're Alex O'Connor, you have to say, well, is this really just it's essentially his argument boils down to this is all much ado about nothing.
Which is
And
why the
so
priests
when
all rip their robes and gnash their teeth.
okay, so that's where and so some of the criticisms against David Wood come mainly not against his arguments, but against his tone.
Oh, sure.
For my part, I think his tone is fine. He has a bit of a warped sense of humor sometimes, and he's just kidding around. But some people, ours is not a moment that is particularly humorous. We've talked about that before. Although Alex O'Connor is pretty funny too. He's got some kind of barbed responses as well himself, and very clever guy. So, and again, I can't state this enough. He carries himself so well in this debate. He's so well spoken, but I think he set himself a pretty difficult task. So he has to basically the crux of his argument is essentially this is all much ado about nothing. It appears that Jesus may be claiming divinity, but if we actually just press into the language here, we'll see that he's not really doing that. So when David Wood tries to press him and say, well, why did he get this? Why this volcanic response to everything he's saying? And if he's just some other guy, he goes, and so Alex will come back and say, well, I'm not saying he's just some other guy. He's clearly a model of faith. Okay. But if he's just a model of faith, so he's some sort of exemplar, that might be one thing, but why so much upheaval around a guy who's okay, not a regular guy, but sort of an exemplar, but certainly not not claiming to be God. In the end, it just he brings in some questions and some concerns, but it fails to make sense of the whole picture because I think Alex O'Connor has an impossible task in this debate
Mhm.
itself.
Yeah, it's not that he's not a good debater, it's that
Not at all. He's a
gets
great
he
debater. Yeah.
he bit off something that no human can really chew.
I think so. Here's what I want to say. A key part of his strategy, Nathan, and this is something that we see in many different sectors, I think revolves around I'm going to just call it disenchantment. So you have something before you that appears to be straightforward or it appears to be something that's quite a big deal. This man who lived 2000 years ago who claimed not just to be some great exemplar, but who claimed to be the Son of God and sent shock waves through the entire world. And his legacy is still very much with us to this day. So Alex O'Connor wants to kind of go the route of, yeah, but he's really not as big of a deal as we think. He may be a good moral teacher. So in some ways he's doing the thing that C.S. Lewis warns so assiduously against. Don't try to just say he's a good moral teacher. He's not that neutral of a figure. He hasn't left that option open to us. That's sometimes called the trilemma, the Lord, liar, lunatic. David Wood's not a fan of Lord Liar, lunatic, although just out of deference to C.S. Lewis wasn't making a formal debate here. This was more of a kind of an observation, but Wood wants to include Lord Liar, legend, and then he also includes the regular guy thing, which is kind of a jab against Alex O'Connor. But in other words, it's hard to kind of explain him away, but this strategy can be very effective, Nathan, in certain sectors. Because if let's say you're a passionate evangelist and you're really excited about Jesus and you're talking to somebody, this is kind of the old apathy card again. And the person, your interlocutor goes, yeah, well, okay. I just don't think he's that big of a deal. He just doesn't mean that much to me. Yes, but he said things that nobody's ever said. Is that really true, though? I mean, I can imagine other people saying, I mean, you can certainly find fragments in other ancient writings of the golden rule, maybe not stated as explicitly, but maybe in the negative, don't do anything to somebody else that you don't want done to you. And yeah, he turns it up a notch, I suppose. It's not really that big of a deal. You do that, you can take the wind out of somebody's sails very quickly. I've also seen it often when people make tuning arguments about the beauty of creation and the created order. Yeah, it's really pretty nasty world though when you think about it. I mean, look at all the waste, look at all the destruction in the world, and there are biological anomalies that simply don't make any sense. The more I'm a biologist. I was talking to somebody recently, Nathan, who said this. I have a PhD in molecular biology, and I can tell you I used to be a Christian. But you look into this stuff deeply enough, there's no design. It's just, in fact, all you see is just kind of cruelty and indifference. Now, that's none of that's an argument. Those are not really arguments, but they're incredibly, incredibly effective, and they can make you feel like you've somehow been subtly undermined. And so that's kind of I don't know if that's making sense, Nathan, but we do part of it. Look at the tonal differences between in the debate, David Wood he's very animated. He talks like this. I don't know how you could just say he's just some regular dude. And Alex O'Connor, just he's very monotone the whole time. He's very, very monotone, speaks like this, just not very little emotion coming through, the occasional joke. Like I said, he's very clever. And I'm not necessarily saying he's being disingenuous. But they very much form these two roles of the passionate believer and the sort of disenchanted, you know, person who really is unclouded and sees things as they actually are and sees very clearly, well, what we have here are certainly some strong statements, but person here who's certainly not claiming to be God. And even if the Jewish priests did think that, how would they know to, I mean, how would they even have doctrinal development that would allow them to think that Jesus would be claiming he was God? I mean, certainly that may not have even been around yet, and certain scholars have raised questions about that. It's a very effective strategy.
Yeah, you can always find a certain scholar who has raised questions about anything.
Of course you can.
I
Yeah.
and I don't say that hyperbolically. You can find a scholar who's raised a question about anything. So, Cameron, what we're dealing with here functionally is a new form of the Pied Piper who's not playing the music that anybody likes, is building an identity off of disagreeing with or subtly giving, I think, is it a call to a profound sense of like I express my individualism by not agreeing with
Hmm.
so what is the desire here of like I build an identity off not of building something, but out of just like meh, meh, no, not really. I can poke holes
Yeah,
in
from
everything.
dissent.
Yeah. So it's yeah, I mean, that seems to be a moment in which that definitely is a plausible. But combine that with the fact of any major. This is not just a religious thing happening. Look at any major, like, oh well, maybe Churchill wasn't such a great guy. Did you like? Did you know there were notes that were found that said this, and this one general said this about him? So maybe Churchill was the real villain of World War II. Um, that type of thing, like, the internet is packed full of, like, this
Mhm.
quasi-alternative niche, um, you could do a YouTube video titled, "Theological Reflections on Genesis Chapter 1," which would get 5 views, or you could do, "Have we been reading Genesis 1 incorrectly for 2,000
Yep.
years?" That will
Yep.
get 2,000,000 views. So, it's that kind of why are we so culturally primed for the alternative is more exciting than the or but here I'll take it a step farther. Oftentimes, the thing that you have to believe is the alternative is more ridiculous
Mm,
than the
yeah.
actual claim itself. So I was talking to somebody this week who was talking about the idea that Jesus went and trained with monks that taught him how to handle pain so that he didn't really die on the cross. Oh,
Mhm.
wow. Okay. So
Yep.
other than the fact we have no historical evidence pointing to that whatsoever, why is that more fascinating to us and more plausible than the actual story as the eyewitnesses wrote it? So it's not just the disenchantment, Cameron. That is a big element of it. It's the attempt to rebuild something out of something that I would say is empirically and epistemologically more ridiculous than the original miraculous claims. Like
We
choose your
yeah.
category. I'm not saying this just religiously. This is true of like from QAnon to pick your major um you know uh yeah I could go
Yep.
on and on about this, but like I'm worried as much as I get
Yep.
worried about stuff of our ability to find the niche, the nuance, the different and then throw out all objective rationality when it comes to evaluating the other claim, almost as if it and to a degree, I understand some of this of like, we're in a moment where like the experts say, everybody will be like, well, yeah, well, experts are clearly wrong about just about everything in the long run. So if the expert says it, probably the opposite of that is true. That
Mhm.
that seems to be the cultural epistemological moment in which we live is that the alternative is almost always true independent of any evaluation other than it's the opposite of what the and okay, I'm fully on board with saying that experts can be wrong and to have a certain degree of skepticism there on any truth claim. But then to turn around and to adopt something that is even more ridiculous than the original, that's where I'm like, what are we what is happening here?
Well, we can't possibly do justice to everything that's happening. What we can do are try to highlight a few of the factors that are contributing, I think. On the one hand, you have an information surplus, and a lot of people have pointed out over the years that tends to cheapen information. But there are different ways in which that's expressed. Usually when I hear people talk about how information is cheap, what they're usually talking about is that people are unwilling to do real research anymore. There's usually some reference made to, "In my day, we had the Dewey Decimal System, and if we wanted to look something up, we didn't have it at our fingertips. We had to go to the local library and hunt it down." And the search was part of the acquisition of the knowledge, and it tended to stick better. I think actually there's a lot of truth to that. But another aspect of it is information's cheap. It's everywhere. And we are also primed for drama and sensation. So
Oh,
you mentioned earlier that if you have a clickbait headline, have we been reading Genesis 1 and 2 wrong for, thousands of years or more, something like that, it tends to grab us and it's interesting. So we are primed to be drawn toward the exotic, toward the sensational. And that's another factor there too. So a lot of these things will grab us because they're designed to be interesting, they're designed to be fun, and they're different. So
okay. All right. All right. Hang on. Before we've I don't know where you're going with this, but I need to throw in like, okay, because we've been talking about this. You've been following the whole thing with Snow White the movie, its implosion, the cultural war that's developed around it.
a
Go
little
ahead and
bit,
watch
yeah.
a little bit,
Yeah.
yeah. I watched some stuff about it a couple weeks ago, and it's like, okay, moving on. However, Cameron, so there's an instance though of somebody's like, we're going to produce Snow White like you've never seen it before. We're going to question the narrative and the characters, and then it turns into this massive cultural backlash. But people are like, no, you can't change these elements of this story. So we are traditional around some things.
Some
Well,
stuff
I
is
mean, but
sacred.
some stuff. So, yeah, but you don't get the same. You wouldn't get the same conservative backlash against somebody who's like, yeah, well, Jesus probably didn't really claim to be God, um, as much as you would like Snow White needs to be white. The categories of our
Hmm,
outrage are
maybe.
interesting,
I don't
like the
know.
ones that we. I don't know either. I'm legitimately thinking
Well, because think about
of
this.
like, are there still cultural touchstones where somebody monkeys with a narrative and then
Yes.
bam, it all cracks loose.
Yes, I mean, well, I don't know if that's true actually, and but just because I'm thinking about a film like The Last Temptation of Christ that came out in the 1980s, Martin Scorsese, Willem Dafoe, and this movie caused a complete and total uproar. I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, you can Google this. I believe it's still on, it may be on the list of movies condemned officially by the Catholic Church. But I mean, that's an example of, but I get what you're saying, Nathan. On the one hand, there's a double standard where people can play fast and loose with anything Christian. But in other categories, those are sacred. Don't mess with Snow White. The interesting thing is I haven't seen the Snow White movie, so I'm not sure just how unorthodox the Snow White movie itself is. I know that Rachel Zegler's interviews are the main source of controversy, and she's made statements that have just, as statements in in these kind of
You could
circumstances
charitably
do
say
get
alienated half of her
politicized.
audience.
For sure. Oh, yes, and that is definitely putting it charitably, and, of course, there's some other interesting factors there too. She became a publicity nightmare for Disney, and so they're severing ties with her, there's all of that. Also, there's part of this, I do think, yeah, she made some impetuous remarks. She's also, what, 23 or 24 years old, all this fame and influence at such an early age. I can't really imagine what I would say.
Yeah, hang on, wait, hang on, but you just said Alex Connor was 26 and
Correct,
did a
yeah.
phenomenal job of cleverly
Fair, yeah, that's
like,
fair.
you thought you knew about the Jesus's claims,
Sure,
but you don't, and here you have
sure.
Rachel saying, "You thought you knew, Snow White, but you don't."
Sure.
Um,
Okay, yeah,
there's
no, point taken for sure, yeah.
I don't know what
You're
the point
right.
is exactly, other than to say
There are some
some
categories where people tend to have less flexibility. I mean, the whole weird world of fandom has it
I
is
no,
is a
here's
whole
what we're saying. Here's what we're saying is that disenchantment works in some categories and not in others. So if we're looking at Rachel Zegler as a disenchanting figure of saying like, "Oh, you thought you knew this, but maybe here's
she
another
doesn't need
take
a
on this."
she doesn't need a prince. It's not even a love story. Yeah, those kinds
No,
of
right.
remarks.
So the disenchantment there doesn't work. The Alex O'Connor, the disenchantment, like, or the molecular biologist, the disenchantment. Like, no, there's nothing
Sure,
enchanting about
sure,
this. Um,
sure.
those are. I haven't quite worked this out in my mind, so hopefully everybody here can constructively do something with this. So thinking like, what are the categories in which we're willing or wanting to be disenchanted versus the ones that we feel like something is
Well, let's play with this for
inherently.
a second, because I think I'm starting to see more of where you're going with that, and it's making more sense. So Christianity, in our cultural moment, can very readily be labeled as just written off as dogma, right? In this sort of, well, it's this is, it's just kind of repressive religious dogma. It's, there are beautiful aspects to Jesus and his teachings, but then the church ruins it all and basically puts chains on the mind and the heart. I think that would be one way of saying it. Whereas a
Something
classic
good here
sort of,
we've lost
there's
the entire
something good
conversation.
here. Yeah, yeah, and so the institutional aspects of it are bad. Jesus himself is interesting, and we can do with, and we can, so I guess we like spirituality, that we want it on our own terms. I think
Oh yeah,
that's the quick way of saying it. So we want Jesus on our own terms.
we want to like Jesus, and where he contradicts us, the church probably messed up what he actually meant and said.
Yes. When it comes to, now here's the thing, Rachel Zegler does have her defenders though. But the problem is,
Mhm.
but here's where Hollywood is running into this problem a lot lately. So on the one hand, they've got a very progressive kind of ideology that they will sometimes want to push forward, but on the other hand, people who vote with their feet are regular Americans and theater goers, many of whom have some fairly traditional views on family and fairy tales. And they don't, and they hear, now I don't know, again, I don't know what this new Snow White actually looks like. I don't know if the story is actually that substantially different, but I do know that the people who have heard the Ben Shapiros and the Ally Beth Stuckey's and the, on and on we could go. Other people take clips from Rachel Zegler. They hear those clips and they think, I have no interest in that whatsoever. And I'm not going to go to the movies. And so now Disney may have some ideals, but they're losing now hundreds of millions of dollars. And this actually isn't an isolated incident for Disney. Disney has been losing money on some of its other projects that are a little bit more in this direction as well. So again, that's that kind of breakdown of the America's sort of elite sectors and institutions do tend to lean progressive, whereas a significant part of the American people and population tend to be a little bit more, at least by Hollywood standards, and this isn't saying much, traditional. I don't know if that.
Let Okay,
Yeah.
let me pull this in. Well said. How do I convince myself of when I should and shouldn't even care about this stuff, Cameron? I think that's getting to be so.
Sure.
Okay,
Great
somebody comes
question.
along
Yeah.
like, well, maybe I don't know. I'm like, okay, so what are you producing and how are you helping? You're not okay. Moving on.
Yeah.
Is there a distracted? So we talked about distraction earlier on. Um, is there a way in which we as Christians can just be like, okay, next? I want to have
Yeah.
I want to love and value the person. However, if you have somebody whose primary identity is everything and everybody else is wrong all the time, there is a
Okay,
biblical
here's
like warn a divisive person once and then don't have anything to do with them.
yeah.
How do you I mean, what are the
Where
principles that
yeah.
we would want to point out here of like
Mm,
we are being captured into this morass of stupidity
yes.
by even giving it the dignity of our time.
Yes. So here's what is anchoring you? That's a really important question because everybody is going to be anchored by something. Another way you could put it is you have some orthodoxy or some form of dogma that is structuring your life. I don't care how free thinking you think you are. I don't care about how
Okay.
skeptical you think
You
you are.
thought about
Some
it or it's given to you and you haven't and don't know it.
and you don't know it. But we all human beings, as human beings, we are inescapably spiritual, dogmatic, and religious creatures. You can't get away from this. Now, in broad terms, if you're a Christian, orthodoxy functions as an anchor for you. This is part of what Paul's getting at when he says, don't be driven, to and fro by every wind of doctrine. This is a big watchword for us today, where our life is just a sea of distractions. Some of them might be interesting, but some of them really are a waste of your time, and some of them will take you off course. And of course, it's important to contextualize this. So let me give you a for instance, just to make this practical. Am I going to watch Snow White? No. Am I going to watch reams and reams of interviews with Rachel Zegler? No. If I were asked to go give a lecture on what's happening on the current state of fairy tales right now and look at this specific film, would I? Yes. Yes, I would. But nobody's asked me to do that. Please don't ask me to do that. Nobody's asked me to do that, and so I'm not. Another case in point, Nathan, you could give examples too. I was asked by several different people to talk about critical theory. So I did a deep dive into critical theory, starting with ancient sources, looking at its kind of predecessors in ancient Greek sophistry and you know discussions about rhetoric, all the way up to Foucault and Derrida.
Yeah,
So,
but
but
nobody wanted that.
does
So
does everybody?
uh,
But look, listen, hold on. But does everybody need to do that? No, no, absolutely not. And in fact, I would actively counsel you against that, unless not because I think it's going to corrupt your mind, but because I think it's going to waste your time.
and point of being taken is that nobody liked the talk that you gave on that
No,
because you didn't
they
say the
didn't.
cultural flashpoint issues that they were expecting you to say on that. You actually looked at it deeply
Yep.
and academically. So,
Well,
so
I gave it in two different places, and in both places, there were murmurs of
it is a great talk, by
discontent.
the way. Total bias is Cameron's friend, but I'm yeah, I think this all comes back to the need for all of us to say, "This is what I'm doing with my life. I've decided to follow Christ. Here's what I'm about. Here are the things that are important to me. Here's the thing that I've been asked to do today." And then we filter all this other stuff around that of saying, "Does this have anything to do with what I'm trying to do in life?"
And
if you don't
yeah,
actually have a goal in
there you
life,
go.
then everything is interesting and everything is relevant and every disenchanted voice or
Ooh.
hyper angry voice applies. But if you actually have like a vision of, I was speaking at West Virginia University Thursday night, and one of the points that I made is that one of the beautiful things about commitment is that, Cameron, let's say, so I'm in West Virginia, let's say I decide to drive down to Georgia to visit you. If I say I'm driving to Cameron's house, I will pass 47,000 intersections between here and there that I do not have to stop at and think, should I take a turn here? Because I have a vision of where I'm trying to go. So I'm headed south. So I don't take roads that go north, east, or west because I'm going this direction. And so that's not being cold hearted and uncalculating or not open to thinking. It's just,
You're not open-minded.
you're not open minded. No, it's like I have a destination.
It's good. It's really good.
I mean, was it the Chesterton quote, like an open mind is only valuable if it's closing in on the truth or something? It's
Yeah.
like an open mouth. It's only somebody look up that quote. But it's a sense of saying like I don't actually have to analyze every single, like when I got married to my wife, that meant that I don't have to process like 6.9 billion other relationships. Right? So sometimes there are things in life you're going to make a commitment to, and then you're going to filter everything else in light of that commitment. And that means you don't have to obsess about um, a deep theory of what's
You
the
know
proper
what?
way to tie your shoes. You just do
This
it.
is really well said, Nathan. You know what else? And this is gonna sound like a truism, but it's not. It'll point to the arrogance lurking behind this all. You're not God. You have finite capacities. You can't explore every option exhaustively. No human being can. You shouldn't
Well,
have to. You shouldn't even want to. It's a ridiculous ambition.
you can't process 99% of them and ever achieve anything in life. There is
You
literally no decision that you can make that I can't push back on and second guess or point to
Yep.
some academic who challenges that maybe it's not a good idea.
We have
I
all of before yeah, that down that road lies madness. That you can go into analysis paralysis and
Everything
never
becomes
yeah,
an option.
total stasis. Yeah. And also, I mean, yeah, I think that's really well said. But what you said, Nathan, earlier is so important. I think we probably need to do another podcast on it. And you talked about if you have no real goal or vision for your life. And therein lies a massive, massive problem in our cultural moment for so many who feel, I think, a sea of options, but are totally shaking their heads, scratching their heads on what a purpose would be, what a vision for life would be, and how they would even get there. I think that's a very, very important discussion in and of
Mm.
itself.
So there are people who are skeptical because they're rejecting something that they've seen, but there are also people who are in tough spots who have never seen an alternative to the vision that they have. And that's a sad thing. And I think that's the incumbent on the missional heart of the church to say, let's at least make sure people have the option of choosing to reject this vision for their lives rather than you're just sitting in an infinite pool of no choice. Um, yeah, work to be done.
Work to be done. And once again, check out Alex O'Connor. He's worth checking out. Check out David Wood at your own risk. I think our comments alone should let you know that you've been warned. But the man is absolutely brilliant and a phenomenal debater and has done wonderful, vital ministry as well and continues to do it at great risk to his life. And that's not an exaggeration, actually.
Check out Father
So
Brown. Fiction
check out.
character.
Oh, yeah. Please read some Father Brown. G.K. Chesterton is a thinker for our moment right now. He is the philosopher of common sense. Check out G.K. Chesterton, and definitely Father Brown is just an absolute delight. Don't watch the TV show. Just read it, okay? For goodness sakes. Come on. You can do it.
Or getting to say. All right. Well, we better wrap it up there. There's a lot more that can be said. And I think actually, Cameron, we're just kind of pushing into beginning to articulate a broader Christian conversation on how we respond well to what we're seeing in our moment. And so I'm sure
Mm.
much more will be said on this in the future. But you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope. I'd also like to point out, Cameron, since we've been talking about Snow White, that statistically 6 out of 7 dwarves aren't happy.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, Or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.